Welcome to the Leadership for Society Speaker Series. This year's theme is Tensions, Business, Civic Society, and Politics. And I'm Brian Lowery, professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. And today I'm talking to Thomas Kurian, the CEO of Google Cloud. Thanks for being here, Thomas.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I just want to jump right in and ask, what technology and services does Google Cloud offer? What do you guys provide?
We provide a broad set of services. I'll summarize them as most customers are using our platform to transform, their technology systems. And so we provide capability for them to rehost legacy applications to build modern applications. We provide technology for them to analyze data and manage large quantities of it. We provide tools to keep them secure from cyber threats and cyber attacks. We give them tools to make their employees more productive, to collaborate with each other, and to communicate using a variety of tools. And then we also provide them capability to use advanced, AI technology. And we help them build applications using AI. We offer our own packaged AI products, and we call those packaged agents. And so there's a variety of things that we offer our customers.
Fantastic. So right now, one of the big concerns is data privacy. So
Yes.
for someone who's just a casual consumer, I'm hearing about places that have my data getting breached all the time. So
Yes.
what are the biggest challenges for you for achieving transparency and managing things like privacy, and even more than that, given the kind of data that you all work with, national security concerns? How do you deal with those issues?
We offer a variety of technologies to protect customers' data. Being a technology provider, typically they fall in 4 or 5 big categories. The first one, can you encrypt my data? And when we say encrypt your data when it's at rest, meaning when it's stored, when it's being moved, and when it's being processed. So we allow people to encrypt it all the time. One of the big things we've introduced that customers find really useful is you can keep the key that you use for encryption away from Google. So you have sort of what they call a separation of concerns between the technology provider, Google, and the customer whose data that they're managing. The second thing, we have a solution to ensure that no Google employee and no other customer has access to your data. Third, you can run your data and any access to it in a secure perimeter, network perimeter. Think of it as you set up a walled garden and you can ensure that the data sits within that walled garden. Fourth, if we get an judicial request, for example, for your data from a government or some other agency, you can deny Google access to the data. So it allows us to say, we would like to comply with the law, but we're asking you to speak to the customer because we can't access the data. That's number 4. Number 5, you have sole control of the location of all your data. A primary copy, secondary copy, any backups, all of that, you control the location. And that is also important because people are worried about under what legal framework will any data access be performed. So we provide all of these as standard solutions. As governments increasingly want national control of the location of data, we also have partnerships in a variety of countries with local companies. In France, for example, we have a partnership with a company called Thales. We have created a new joint venture with them called Sans, allows French companies to use our cloud, which provides all of the data privacy controls, but Thales can audit our operations independently of us and provide an additional level of verification and control for French customers. So we've done that in a number of countries similar to that.
Yes, those are amazing. It sounds like security measures, which also raises a question for me because you mentioned that sometimes authorities might want your data. And so the question becomes, if you can't access the data, what about national security concerns? Like, what if there's data that is actually really important or potentially useful for national security reasons? How would that get managed? Like, should governments have access to that kind of data that has significant national security concerns?
Well, we generally say that governments should, customers, we're a technology provider.
Mm.
In general, we've said customers own their data. We're providing a technology to process that data. Think about if you were not running a cloud and you were using the systems in your own data center,
Mhm.
what some people call, the older architecture where you ran systems in your data center. If a government wanted a set of data from a company, they would ask that company, give us your data. We're not precluding that in any way. The only thing we want to make sure is that when you run your systems in a cloud, governments don't ask the cloud provider to hand over a customer's data, because it makes customers feel uncomfortable on whose data is it and who has control of it.
Hmm. And you also mentioned AI, and I want to dive into that a little bit. And there's talk about AI is everywhere these days. Can you tell us, when you say AI, what are you referring to? What counts as AI?
There are 3 or 4 different flavors of processing capability that we provide, and we talk about them, some of them as machine learning and others as artificial intelligence. I'll explain them just to give you an example. There are many companies who use our data platforms to consolidate and aggregate data, and then they do prediction. For example, there are many companies who store their supply chain inventory and revenue data, and then they want to run predictions saying, if these trends continue, can you extrapolate for me what my revenue picture looks like, or will I have inventory shortages? Those are more statistical, or what's called Bayesian by nature. We typically refer to them as machine learning. Separately, we have algorithms that are, that we call artificial intelligence. There are 2 or 3 different flavors of those. Think about when you call a call center and you have a request coming in and you have a virtual agent handle that call. It's using a capability we call conversational AI, and that's built on a neural network. And so that's an example of where we can answer questions. We can also generate answers based on data that the model was trained on. Historically, when you generate an answer, that's called generative AI. There are other kinds of neural network models that we also provide. So that hopefully gives you a range of what we consider AI.
Right. And when you describe it, it sounds technical and something that, I mean, you can generally understand at a high level.
That's right.
But people seem to think of it as differently somehow than other technological innovations. People have a different response to AI. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a lot of news in the press about AI. AI has lots of implications because it's a general purpose technology that has advanced computing in a fundamental way. So it brings a lot of attention on what are the kinds of capabilities that can it offer, because it's a horizontal computing paradigm shift, meaning it applies to many, many different domains. It applies to many different industries. It applies to many different functions within a company. It affects how people learn a new technology. You can get assistance if you're writing software, as an example. And so because of that, there's a lot of curiosity on what does AI, and more recently, what does generative AI mean?
Hmm. And so, what's interesting about this, even people who are well versed in technology, some of them are talking about it as an existential threat, right? So you have people out there saying this is really going to be potentially that has the seeds of the end of humanity, or something very extreme. And there are other people who are really excited about how it's going to transform how we do work and how we operate as a society in a positive way. I'm curious where you fall in that spectrum. Presumably, you're more positive, given that you're the CEO of Google Cloud. But I'm curious how you think about those different responses.
Any new technology has always got promise, but it also has other implications, and that can be more negative. And it's always important that you are open-minded on both ends of the spectrum. I'll give you a practical example. We were helping doctors in a hospital find information. And when I say find information, compare information from the electronic health record, look at x-rays, and also understand the latest treatment instructions from the CDC. Models can now synthesize and summarize that information, making it much easier for them to see a summary before they see the patient. So that's a practical example. We've had people in health insurance, for example, streamline how quickly they can answer questions when somebody's waiting. There are many, many, many hundreds of examples of companies and people we've assisted in using AI tools to solve business problems, to enable improved customer experience, etc. At the same time, there are a number of examples of things that we take on as responsibility as a technology provider to evolve the technology and also to evolve the policy framework. So an example is people have asked us, hey, if you can generate images using a model, how do I make sure that the model is generating images that have no violent images? Because if I'm a organization that's building stuff for kids, how do I make sure they don't see it? How do I make sure when you have a system that answers questions on behalf of a customer, it doesn't generate abusive language or threaten the user? So we've introduced a variety of things in our platform for what we call safety and responsibility controls that protect, against some of the negative ramifications of the technology. And we're obviously working on new things. Verification, for example, because people ask us if you can generate using models lots of false information and put it up on the web. How do you guarantee that an answer is based on factual information as opposed to fake information? So there are many, many things that we're working on by ourselves. We're working in concert with others, companies, and we're also in discussion with governments to ensure the right policies are put in place.
So I'm going to stick with this for just a second. Recently there was an election in Pakistan, and the person who won was actually in jail at the time. And what was interesting, what's relevant here is they put out a speech using AI from the person that was in jail, right? So they had in his voice, and I just, that was striking to me that people have the capability to do that. And I see that as a potential for me on the outside. Again, I see that as a potential threat to, say, our political system, how democracy works. Can we trust information? As you look out there and you see how it's being used, what would you say are the biggest risks? What are things that you really focus on? You're like, we need to make sure we mitigate these kinds of risk in particular. Which ones are you most concerned about?
So one, I'll give you, we're working on a variety of fronts, but I'll give you 2 or 3 examples just to illustrate the kinds of things that we're working on. One, when you just imagine you're getting information summarized by a model. And in the example of healthcare, you're getting information synthesized by a model. Commonly, people have heard about something called hallucination, where a model makes up an answer. In many scenarios, that can be somewhat problematic. And obviously in healthcare, you don't want the model to make up an answer, even in a summary that the doctor is going to read, because it could waste a doctor's valuable time. So we're working on solutions to improve what's called factuality and enable and eliminate hallucination as much as possible using techniques for grounding, which is comparing the answer a model is generating against other sources. So that's an example. If you look at people who are writing documents and they want assistance in writing, one of the things they want to know is the model generating information, and from what sources is it generating that information? In academic publications, people have historically used citations. So we've built a capability for the model to do citation. And citations can even be helpful if you're writing software code. If you're a programmer and you see a bunch of code generated, you're wondering, where did that code come from? So you can use it to generate citations. We worked on a technology when you move beyond text to new forms of media like images. People asked us, how can I tell if an image was generated by a human or generated by a model? And generated by a human could be a painting or could be a photograph that somebody's taken. So we introduced a technology called digital watermarking, where the watermark is generated by a model and is indelible in any image that the model generates. And that way, later on, you can come back and compare if there is a watermark in the picture or not. And it's, even if you edit the pixels of the image, the watermark is is indelible. So there's, we're working on a variety of these things. Every step of the way, we are inventing new technology to ameliorate some of the problems. But we are always aware that, that there will always be more things that we need to solve.
Hmm. And and thinking about those risks, there's an asymmetry in information and understanding, right? So you understand this deeply, being a part of the industry and CEO of a major tech company. But for most people, they only see what they hear in the newspapers, and they're trying to figure out how is this going to affect their lives. How do you think about the role of companies like yours in educating the public on the risks and the benefits of AI?
We definitely take that responsibility very seriously. We see our work as important in educating multiple constituents or stakeholders. First, obviously, when companies use our technology, we spend a lot of time educating them on how best to use it, where to use it, how to use it, what are the safeguards that they need to think about. For example, if they're using our models to then tune it with their data, how do we make sure their data doesn't leak out? And we have solutions to all of that. So one constituency is our customers. The second constituency is policymakers. Policymakers, this landscape is evolving very quickly, and policymakers need to understand what is possible with the technology if you want to, control or regulate it in certain ways. And so we're in discussion with policymakers in many, many different countries to ensure that we get the right framework on policy. Third, we spend a lot of time educating users about it. Users of all our products are, products like Gmail and other things that people use, as well as our consumer services. And so we take that responsibility seriously, and we're investing in both advancing the technology, because that's always important, and educating people about it.
Mhm. And what you mentioned, regulatory frameworks. What do you think is the proper role of regulation in this kind of industry? Because again, as you mentioned, tech often moves much faster than politicians or the public's ability to understand how they're evolving. So, how do you think about putting in a regulatory framework that best serves the public interest when things are moving so quickly?
There are many, many things that governments are looking at which are very constructive. I mean, regulation is a vast topic which we won't have time to discuss. But examples are things like, IP protection, intellectual property protection, copyright, fair use of data, security. There's a variety of different dimensions on which people are looking at it. And we're in discussions with governments around the world because as a technology provider, we have to hear their concerns. We have to adopt, and in some cases, adapt the technology to meet it. Like a very simple example, digital watermarking we built after discussions with a number of customers, as well as with governments who wanted a way to mark an image or a piece of audio or a piece of video that was generated for the purposes of verification.
Yeah. So, one of the things that is become clear is that AI needs a lot of data to grow, right? So these models require a lot of data to learn and adapt. And there have been concerns about where this data comes from. So this is less about protecting the customer's data and more about the data that the models are trained on. How do you think about making sure that the models have the data to work on and avoiding overreach? And maybe this is a separate issue, but I think related, avoid building in the kind of biases or whatever else that's in the data that the AI models are learning from.
We've done a lot of work and research. I mean, first of all, I would not assume that in order for models, today we are in the incredibly nascent stage with these models, even though people feel like we've been living with them for a long time. We're in the very nascent stages with these models. There's a lot of work that we've done. One, to reduce the amount of data that a model needs in order to learn. And the value is the following. Think about you're in rare diseases and you want a model to synthesize information about it. Well, there isn't a lot of data about rare diseases. So by definition, you will not have a good model if it requires a lot of data to be trained. So one thing we are doing is reducing the quantity of data to make a model respond in a fine-tuned way. And there are many, many values to that. For example, if a person wants a model to write in their own personal style, do they have to give it 100,000 documents or 50 documents to train it, right? So there are many places where having less data to tune a model is valuable. The second thing that we're working on is domains like transfer learning. Transfer learning is, take a practical example, on the internet, the languages that dominate the internet, there's a few languages. There are other languages that are much sparser on the internet. So if you want good quality results, for example, for search and expressiveness in those languages, if it was that you have to have as much data in one of those languages as you do in English or Mandarin, for example, you would never get them to be of high quality. So examples of new techniques like transfer learning can also help there. Third one, we want smaller companies and smaller organizations to be able to do the same thing that larger organizations have. And smaller companies typically don't have as much data that they can access. So we've come up with ways to do synthetic data generation. Synthetic data generation that you can ensure that both is not statistically biased and reflective of the skew that you want in the data to train it, and also is fully auditable so that you can see what data sets you're using to train the model. So there's a lot of things we're doing to improve the quality and the amount of data that you need to give a model. And in general, our view is if you can give a model a smaller amount of higher quality data to improve its efficacy, it's better than giving it a large volume of low quality data. So that's one set of things. We're also working on ensuring that any data that we're training our models with are done with appropriate safeguards. For instance, we've announced an opt-out clause for publishers. If they don't want their data to be trained on, they can opt out from it. We've introduced indemnification for our enterprise customers so that they can trust that our data the data we've trained the model on has met the appropriate criteria, and we indemnify people when they use our data, when they use our models, so that we provide them the right protections. And then lastly, if you're a business customer using our cloud, either a small business, a government agency, a large enterprise, we have very strict contractual terms and conditions that your data is your data, and we will not take your data to improve our models. You have to explicitly tell us you're okay with that, and you have to grant us permission if you do, but we have a strong stance on your data is your data, and we're not using it in any way.
Mm-hmm. And, in a lot of these answers, you're highlighting that you are providing, in some sense, a support system to businesses that are trying to use your computing services and AI tools. And so I'm curious about maybe the unintended consequences of the development of new tools. And I'll give you an example. So when we think about social media, for example, it was a way to connect people. It was when it started, and if we can think back to when it first started, it's very exciting to be connected with people all over the world, maintain those connections. But then you could argue, and some people do, that the business imperative of attention from social media has produced some significant social costs.
For sure.
And I think of that as a tension between the business imperative as it was constructed and the social good. And if you look ahead in terms of your industry, AI tools, cloud computing, where should we worry about that potential tension? Like, where could that tension arise between the public good and the sort of business imperative of using these tools?
Almost every technology in the long arc of history, at the point at which it's introduced, take automobiles. When they were introduced, people said, hey, anyone can now get around. You can get around a lot faster. Imagine if we were all riding a horse and buggy, right? But at the same time, many years later, people look at it and say automobiles are a big source of pollution and environmental change is happening because of that, and environmental pollution. So every technology has that arc where when it's introduced, people are excited about the promise, but you have to look over the long term to see what are the consequences and mitigate those. My sense is we're very early on AI, to get a sense of what would be the downstream implications of these things. There are people who are worried about no one will have jobs anymore. There'll be massive displacements in the economic sector. There will be national security threats of all kinds. And those are all things that are over the long arc. We have to, as a technology company, our goal has always been to support people in using it, but then to ensure we put in place the provisions to mitigate against some of these negative consequences.
Mm-hmm. And what final thought would you like to leave the audience with? So I'll give you the final word. If you're sitting here and you know what you read in the newspaper, what would you want people to know that they wouldn't have access to generally about the kind of things that you all work on?
I mean, I would say that this technology is very early in its life. It's evolving quickly. Many people tend to extrapolate, directly from where it is. For instance, people say, hey, models are expensive to train. Soon you will, if you extrapolate how many chips and machines you need, you will have a need for more energy than the world has ever done, without realizing that these things can get efficient over time, right? So one thing I would say is the technology is very early. There are many, many things being done to improve the efficacy of it, to improve its safety, to meet requirements that would ensure that as consumers used it, they would be kept safe from it. And particularly at Google, given many people use our search and our platforms like YouTube to discover information, find it, we take the responsibility to ensure information is factual, it's trustworthy, because if you don't have that, people wouldn't see the value that comes from capabilities like the internet offers. And so we take that responsibility. My message to everybody is we're helping invent the technology, but we're doing it in a very responsible way because we recognize, the consequences of the value that a technology can have, but also the negative elements of a technology if it's not designed the right way.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you.